fun.
Good afternoon. We're thrilled to be here. I hope you've had a really good day. I'm Nathan Shedroff. I'm the program chair of a MBA in Design Strategy program here at California College of the Arts, just about a mile away here in San Francisco.
And my name is Chris Nossel. I'm Director of Interaction Design at local interaction design agency Cooper.
I should say I'm an interaction designer in my background too, so the two of us together have had a really interesting time over the last 3 years investigating science fiction with an eye towards interaction design to see if we could find lessons and influences, and that's really what we're here to present to you today. We're working on a book, and we're going to show you probably the pinnacle, just a little tip of the iceberg of a tremendous amount of material that we've investigated and lessons that we found. We only have so much time this evening, so we're going to show you some of the best things that we've found. Suffice to say that it's probably accurate to say that Chris and I have been investigating this work for a lot longer than 3 years, probably our entire lives, because we're both big science fiction buffs.
It's okay to say nerds, Nathan. It's okay to say nerds.
We're amongst friends, right?
So those are pretty big words, design and science fiction. So as we're sort of talking about this nexus between them, what we really ought to do is define our terms a little bit more. So since we're looking at interface design, that leads us down a road to take a look sometimes at notions of interaction design, how people are using things, industrial design, the way they're designed and physically, and information design, the way people understand what's on the screen. But really, our focus is on interface design. That's where we started.
And one of the things that we're not looking at is technology, right? So we're not questioning whether a transporter is possible or whether this technology or that technology is accurately represented or not. We're looking at the design of the interfaces themselves.
So given that that's sort of our design focus, when we talk about science fiction, that's a pretty big word as well. And we're actually talking about some smaller things within there. The first thing is that in order to understand and evaluate the interface, we actually have to see it. So interfaces as they're described in literature, as they're described in books, are sort of out of our consideration, even though we're big fans. The second thing is that we need the interfaces to be moving. We need to see people use them. So interfaces as presented in graphic novels or comic books are also sort of out of our purview. And finally, they need to be as consistent as possible between depictions so that we're sort of evaluating a single thing rather than different things as they are drawn. So that means that our first pass is actually excluding hand-drawn animation. What that leaves us with is 3D animation and live action, screen-based science fiction, as it appears either on television or in movies.
Now, we've watched a lot of science fiction here. We're going to share with you some of the best things that we've found. Hopefully you'll have as much fun as we've had, but it's probably worth saying we haven't seen everything. We haven't had time to investigate all science fiction, and there's probably a likely chance that we have missed something that's very near and dear to your heart. We haven't watched every movie or every television show. Hopefully we've gotten some of the most important things that you're going to enjoy, and they're in the presentation today, but just cut us a little slack. There's a lot of science fiction out there. Specifically, there's a lot of foreign science fiction from the UK and then from Europe and Asia that we just haven't gotten to yet. We will get there eventually.
So if that's the sort of design we're looking at, interface design, and that's the kind of sci-fi that leads us to, which is screen sci-fi, what we've done over the past several years is watch a lot of science fiction. We watched it growing up, but this time we actually paused on interfaces and made a giant online database of I think we've got about 10,000 images right now of interfaces from all of the properties that we've looked at. Then we sort of clustered little bits from that online database into meaningful sort of interface groupings. We wrote about them, and then we provided tags for what that interface is. Then we took a look at the resulting tag cloud, and that was the basis for our investigation. One of the greatest things that we love about this tag cloud is if you really want to know what science fiction is, it glows.
There's a lot of definitions of science fiction. We haven't been able to nail down one that we're ourselves happy with. There's a lot of other definitions out there. I think that's maybe one of the best ones.
It's the one we're going to use going forward. So that's sort of what we've done and got to this point. And what we're going to talk about today isn't the model for how to get lessons out of science fiction, but more about influence. So to that end, the sort of first lines of influence that we see between these two are that design doesn't happen in a vacuum. Science fiction doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are actually people who make these things, and those people live in the world and can just respond to the things that they see in the world. So individual designers see things in science fiction, they're like, wow, that's really inspirational. People who make science fiction may see something in the real world, and they're like, hey, this is great. I can use that for my work. Those are small and sort of idiosyncratic, and we can't really use those because they're little stories. But the other lines of influence that we're tracing can actually sort of be used, or like macro effects. This first one that you see, the way that interface design in the real world affects that in screen science fiction is by establishing the actual paradigm that science fiction extends. That's sort of a mouthful, so I like to repeat that when I present, which is that the real world establishes the paradigm that science fiction then extends. In turn, science fiction influences real world interface design in 3 ways. The first way is by setting all of our expectations. We've seen stuff, on screen, the little one or the big screen for such a long time. We get upset when it's not here. There's a great book called Where's My Jetpack that sort of echoes these sentiments very well. The second way is by establishing the social context in which these interfaces have to occur. Of course, they're aliens, but they're really people using these interfaces, and people have certain limitations that have to be respected. Oftentimes, these things sort of come out to us when we see interfaces that don't work in science fiction. And the final way is by establishing new paradigms, actual new technologies that aren't out there and where designers can sort of reach in, investigate, and sort of pull lessons from. So the first part we're going to do is we're going to go in and take a look at this big macro arc, how design sort of influences science fiction. And the way we did this in our investigation was that we mapped all of our interface screen grabs onto a timeline and then compared that to timeline of technology in order to sort of understand which came first, the chicken or the sci-fi egg.
We'll start here at 1902. With what's largely referenced as the first science fiction film. This is 1902, La Voyage de la Lune. Now, what's interesting about this, most UX folks know the term direct manipulation. This is sort of direct manipulation because there's no interfaces at all here. We don't have systems in our life that are terribly complex in the turn of the last century or last turn of the century. So what we see are things like you want to send men to moon, you put them in a bullet-like thing and you shoot them out of a big gun. You want to open a door, you push on the door. There's not even a door knob, which would be at least some sort of an affordance or interface. So this sort of sets the foundation of where science fiction has built upon all this time.
And in fact, the sort of really rich thing about that is there is no interface there because they were operating on an industrial age metaphor, a paradigm. But if we jump ahead to sort of the next major science fiction milestone, which is Fritz Lang's masterpiece Metropolis from 1927, we do see a more serious look at an interface in science fiction. Here I'll tell you a little bit about the story. Joe Fraterson is this fellow sort of walking through the door. He is coming into his office in the upper city in order to check this big device in the wall, which is more or less a giant video phone. 2 things I'd like to call your attention as we watch this clip. The first thing is the mix of metaphors that are apparent here, and I'll talk a little bit over it to point that out. But the second thing I want to draw your attention to is how it is that he tells the system what video channel he wants to see. So the first thing he does is he comes to a ticker tape to check his messages. Sure enough, he's got one. So he turns a dial to turn the machine on. He gets a little bit of feedback, and now he's looking at video. And notice that he's having to tune the video. As soon as he's got the video channel he wants, he picks up the telephone, presses a little button that ignites some lights down in the lower city for Grot to know, hey, Grot, you've got a telephone call. Grot comes up, and I love that scene, so I'm going to pause it there. Let's contrast this notion with something that we see 12 years later in the short serials Buck Rogers that appeared before longer pieces of cinema. And in this clip, we're looking at a very similar device. It's an on-screen video device. But again, pay attention to how these users tell the system which video channel they want to see.
Wilmer and Rogers must prevail on the Saturnians to lend them a spaceship to return to Earth.
That's no Saturnian craft, Doctor. It's one of Killer Kane's spaceships.
Impossible.
I know that type of ship too well to be mistaken. Have you tried to contact them on our wavelength?
As a matter of fact, I haven't.
Well, we must do so at once.
So the funny thing is that now they go into another room to have audio contact with that exact same ship. It's very quaint. But okay, so that was a lot simpler. He just turned a knob in order to get sort of a different video channel. So Fritz Lang could have done it this simply. There's nothing stopping him from imagining this future. But why did the makers of Buck Rogers feel a lot more confident that they could do that? What happened in between? Well, the answer is television. We had mechanical television before that, but it was postage stamp sized and like in London, and nobody really had seen it. It was a novelty. But electronic television had actually sort of taken certainly the Western world by storm at this point. And audiences had access to the notion that, video, I can just turn a channel. And then discreetly, I go from one channel to the other. And you can see that Fritz Lang didn't have that metaphor out there, so he had to sort of really take time to tell the audience, this is how what's happening is happening. It's like radio, but video. Whereas the makers of Buck Rogers were able to say, no, just like your TV, but bigger.
And so we see all these examples that seem quaint to us today, like, oh, there's such technology innocence, and we're so much more sophisticated these days, right? So just in case this is your opinion, I want to absolve you of it very quickly. We always need, audiences always need these cues to know what's going on, or else we get lost. Many of you have probably seen the movie Dune. Most people couldn't figure it out because they didn't bother to take the time to sort of explain what was going on. They just sort of went ahead full speed ahead. And so this example from 1993, Jurassic Park, famous, wonderful example, watch for the cuts to her hand.
It's a Unix system. I know this. It's all the files of the whole park. It tells you everything. I gotta find the right file.
Try to reach the gun.
I can't get it unless I move!
So this is a great moment. Why do they have to cut down to the mouse? Well, people in the audiences were familiar with computers. Computers were sort of around, but they weren't familiar with 2D interfaces or graphic user interfaces, and certainly not with mice yet. Maybe some of the more technical people around had seen these or used these, but most people hadn't. So they have to do this little cutaway so that they know how she's controlling this device, how she's controlling the computer. There's also a really nice moment here. I just want to make sure doesn't go by you, because we've seen moments constantly throughout science fiction where they're kind of like interface mistakes that don't make a lot of sense once you start examining interfaces from an interaction design point of view. And that is when you saw the spatial user interface that, the entire lab complex is represented as the buildings, and you click on a building and then you get to the controls, and she's looking for the lab building so she can click on the controls and lock the doors automatically. And what's weird about this is that there's a spatial metaphor. There's the buildings on the screen, but she has to wait until it gets closer to the center of the screen. In reality, of course, this is a real interface. You would just click on it as soon as you saw it, and there would be the controls, and ta-da, it would be over, right? We've locked the doors. Why don't we see that happening? We have this careful construction in the film about this new thing, a spatial interface for buildings and controls. Why do they just break it all of a sudden and ignore it in order to play this little game? Well, because they needed tension, right? So we'll see examples later on where they carefully construct a really interesting interface that's often new to the audience and even the technically minded in the audience, and then they go break it for some diegetic reason, which is a fancy way of saying they needed tension in the film.
So hopefully we have done our job here in this short sort of intro and asserted successfully that interface design helps establish the paradigm that science fiction is sort of able to extend in its narratives. Now we're going to go down deeper and look at that idiosyncratic line of individual inspiration. The first thing we're going to look at is an example of how, for lack of a more forgiving term, people just rip off the real world. We're going to start taking a look at the Visible Human project. If you're not familiar with this, let me tell you a little bit about it. It started in 1989, and A number of scientists sort of asked for a volunteer from a convict to volunteer their body post-mortem. They got a number of volunteers, and once that convict died, they froze them in a block of blue ice and then began to shave that block every couple of millimeters. And then they scanned every shaving, and then they put it all online into this giant database that you can interface with and move through the Z, X, and Y axis, and it's a lot of fun. It's really sort of beautiful.
Who's having steak for dinner?
So we're really fond of this project, and we're pretty sure somebody who was involved in the interface creation at Fox Studios was also really fond of it. In this scene, a security guard is bringing a dinner for Magneto, and let's watch what happens on screen as they scan him for metal. Boop. Hey, that looks kind of familiar. And in fact, this is just a good example of one way that people in science fiction can use sort of the cool stuff that they see in the world. And I'm sure they got permission and didn't need to sort of say, hey, this is from the Visible Human Project. But it certainly is like an influence from the real world.
So another example that we see comes from the art world, not the world of technology and design. This is a controversial artist named Damien Hirst. He's had many different kinds of art in his career. This is from a series of essentially pickled animals in big glass cases of formaldehyde. In this particular example, he actually sliced up the cow and separated it into separate cases. You could sort of squeeze through them to see. Pretty provocative image, certainly in the gallery it was when it was new. How many people have seen the film The Cell? Right on. Beautiful film. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth watching, specifically for the production design. And in the film, we have this scene. I love the neigh when that happens.
Don't worry, it's not real.
It's just really cool. So again, direct influence of inspiration. In fact, I wouldn't really call this ripping off Damien Hirst. If anything, it's probably more accurate to call it homage because it's so lovingly done and probably directly referenced. I don't think anyone that had seen Damien Hirst's work would not realize the reference. And they've sort of done it one better because it's not real, because it's all computer-generated animation. The horse is alive, and you can see the heart beating, and you can do things that Damien Hirst could never have done. So these are two examples of direct influence from the real world, whether it's design or technology or art, influencing something that we see in science fiction.
So those are two examples of sort of that idiosyncratic line of individual inspiration. Now we're going to go down and take a look at that same sort of line of individual inspiration, but down the way science fiction influences real-world design. And this is sort of one of my favorite stories across our research. And it starts in 2000. So in the year 2000, a fellow by the name of Douglas Caldwell was successfully petitioned by his teenage son to go see a movie about superheroes. Now, Doug doesn't care about superheroes, but he wanted to sort of spend time with his son, so he went. But to his surprise, over the course of the film, he saw the solution to a 2,000-year-old problem that he'd been working on.
Magneto is here, Liberty Island. Now, presumably, his objective is to mutate the world leaders at the UN summit on Ellis Island.
He doesn't know his machine kills. And judging from what the professor saw, if Magneto gave Rogue enough power, he could...
Boom. So the reason that this particular interface was of interest to Douglas is that he worked for the US Army Topographical Engineers. It's his job to outfit generals in the field with 3D models of the field of war. This is a problematic exercise, right? He has to model the terrain. He's got to then package it, ship it out to a war field, hope it doesn't break, and more importantly, hope he didn't get it wrong. What he saw here in the X-Men movie was a way to represent any topography at any time. So, based on this scene from the movie, he wrote an RFP. He selected a company by the name of Xenotran to help him make this device.
He actually referenced that scene in the film in the RFP.
And within 4 years had a working prototype of the Xenovision. This is the device with the top down. Let's sort of go and look at the top up. So right there, that's exactly what we saw in the film, but that in the film, of course, it was computer generated. It's an array of computer-controlled pins that can rise and fall according to any topography, but they did it one better. That top can fold down, and that thin skin on top is a rubber sheet that can be vacuum sealed onto the top for a smooth surface that they then project satellite images on. Suddenly, they now have a solution that it's bigger and probably heavier than the original sand tables, is what they call them, that they used to ship out in the field, but it can represent not only any place on Earth, given the satellite imagery and topography, but they can even model terrain on Mars. They've modeled the historic battlefield, and they've even modeled things across time, such as the tsunami in the Philippines in 2008. Wonderful device, and it all came about because Douglas sat in a film watching the X-Men.
So we're going to look at another line of influence between science fiction and how it's influencing the real world, and that is it sets expectations. It sets expectations for audiences based on what they see. They start to expect this stuff to come out. Also sets expectations for designers and engineers and developers like us about what's possible and what's even probable or even desirable. A great example of this that we see throughout science fiction for the last 60 years or more is the idea of robots. And this is one of the, it's not the first image of robots in science fiction. Very famous one, Gort. Kind of an imposing fella, it's hard to tell there, but he's actually a lot bigger than a human. And he's opposed with the entire military here, trying to help his master. And this also sets up a paradigm of expectations of robots, that robots are here to serve us, because that's what Gort does. He serves his master here. And he's actually coming out to help him because he's been shot and he needs medical attention. So the last 60 years of science fiction have familiarized us with the idea of robots, and by us I mean audiences, to the point where, no, it's not such a big deal. We all just know that, like the jetpack, we're going to have robots someday.
Good morning, sir. Yet another on-time delivery from... Get the hell out of my face.
Yeah. They become so familiar where they're kind of bothersome and annoying at times, right? So we all can imagine robots in our lives, and we're all sort of ready for them to happen. Well, this has influenced billions of dollars of R&D funding spent on things like Osimo here from Honda, which is an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology that's being used or tested to deliver 4 cups of coffee down a hallway, right? Now, why does Osimo have to have this independent bilateral symmetry, humanistic form in order to deliver coffee? Well, because we've seen it in the movies. Like, we're expecting it, right? Osimo, for a lot less money, could have been a, specialized robotic cart on wheels that maneuvers itself through the hallway that, you pick up your coffee off of, right? Wouldn't be as much fun, and by the way, it wouldn't be fulfilling the expectations that we've seen. And so these kinds of expectations being set in science fiction are actually really powerful. Literally billions of dollars are going into experiments like this. Now, I'm not saying that it's not valuable to do this kind of research. It's certainly very cool. But these aren't the kind of robots that we see in the bulk of the spectrum of robotdom these days, because all of the robots that are really under heavy-duty use are like construction robots. You see them on assembly lines, and they look nothing like Osimo because they look nothing like people, because they don't have to look like people. Our expectations, however, of their peopleness have been set through science fiction. So this is another really good example of expectations being set for us. This is 1966. I think you'll all know where it's from.
Ship I was talking to them. Suddenly it went dead. No static, just nothing.
Kirk to Enterprise.
You don't want to use this.
Scotty.
Gives it to IT.
Nothing wrong with the communicator, sir.
Yeah, they're no help. The one thing that this clip proves, though, I think it's very clear that we know that AT&T survives to the 24th century. So what's going on here? Well, this is a moment, just one of very, very many in the Star Trek franchise, and in fact, series and series of scenes where we see this kind of flipped out communicator, mobile communicator device. We've known this since 1966. We all know this is coming because science fiction told us so. So that date is really important, 1966. Exactly 30 years to the year, we get the StarTAC flip phone, the first flip phone from Motorola. 30 years later, this is sort of now a realization, and it's such a reference to the show that they even went as far as to call it the StarTAC, right? It's just that close to Star Trek. What's happening here is that audiences are familiar with this form factor. Even though no one has ever seen this in a mobile phone on the market before, it's a success because we've essentially seen it and have used it in our minds for the last 30 years. Not only was it an expectation that was set and sort of pre-learned by the audience, but it was also an expectation set for the development team. In fact, we've heard rumors of, it's probably anecdotal, we can't prove them, that on the team, the engineers on the team developing this phone referenced the communicator often because that's what they had grown up with. So not only audiences are having their expectations set, but us developers are as well.
And the lines of influence aren't just sort of way back in 1996, but sort of continue to today. You may know that the Star Trek The Next Generation in 1987 had a device called the PAD, which stood for the Personal Access Display Device, which was a small tablet with a screen that you could hold in your hands, hold in your lap, and work on applications in your quarters.
It'll never happen.
Huh?
It'll
It'll never happen. Well, of course, many people sort of noted when the iPad came out in 2010, hey, isn't that funny that that scene or that device from Star Trek The Next Generation sort of presaged it? But it's easy to sort of understand that, oh, any sort of set of designers, whether they're in science fiction or the real world, might have sort of come up with a similar device, except that we have evidence that Steve Jobs, through Pixar, sort of seeded this idea even earlier than that. And did it deliberately. So in this scene from The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible receives a message in the mail from Mirage.
My name is Mirage. We have something in common. According to the government, neither of us exist.
And aside from the lenticular screen, boy howdy, that looks an awful lot like an iPad. So we're not going to sort of second guess Jobs here, but it's sort of apparent that we're seeing some things that in movies that end up in our hands 6 years later. It may be a little more deliberate nowadays than it was before.
At least we didn't have to wait 30 years this time. Right?
Yeah, that's nice. And I do want to say, sort of, I know that we're talking about, hey, wow, wasn't that cool that Star Trek The Next Generation sort of presaged the iPad? But I do want to give a shout out to the original series for presaging the tablet PC in 1966.
So another mechanism with which science fiction is influencing the design of interfaces today is it sets and it plays to the social context that exists, whether that's between humans or, in some cases, aliens, et cetera. And the first way it does this actually references back to the robots and anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is the depiction of systems or technology with human-like characteristics. Robots themselves, if they sort of look human-like, is an anthropomorphic effect. It's certainly not necessary for technology, but we see a great deal of it, and we see a lot of it in design. So here we have a couple references of anthropomorphism that haven't been particularly successful. Microsoft Bob, many of you remember Clippy. Most of you probably don't recognize on the right a character named Ms. Dewey. This was a search engine that Microsoft was experimenting with. It was actually out there in the wild. It was a video interface, a video front end to what was essentially a Bing search engine. And what was interesting is you didn't really interact with the video character, Ms. Dewey. You still sort of typed in a search field, your search query, and you got another page with search results that really didn't look anything that much different than a Bing or a Google or a Yahoo. But they had this video front end. And like Clippy and like Bob, Bob was actually kind of innocuous. He was kind of a sad little character.
Yeah.
Clippy was, full-on annoying, right? What was interesting about Ms. Dewey is that they chose like they chose the personality characteristics for Bob and Clippy, they sort of chose to make her not a particularly sympathetic character. She would sort of strut around, and she didn't even smile very much. She would just sort of humped around, and she was kind of a bitch.
Yeah.
So what's curious about this is if you were going to play this game of anthropomorphism, which is really difficult to play well, why would you choose these kinds of characteristics to play it? Why not at least play it a little bit safer and make these likable characters? So we see another example of this that actually was a lot more successful. This is the famous Knowledge Navigator industrial film that Apple put out. This is 1987, and in it there's an agent named Phil.
You have 3 messages. Your graduate research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock. You need to take Kathy to the airport by 2.
So Phil here, we don't have the same kind of expectations of, and if you watch the whole video, it seems a much more natural interaction, much more successful use of these kinds of agents or guides in the interface. Why? Well, Phil isn't exactly a fun-loving guy, but he's also not annoying. His lack of personality, or his representation of so little personality, is actually sort of comforting because it doesn't get in the way. It doesn't excite us. He's not going to be our best friend, but it also doesn't annoy us. And this is probably a more successful example of playing this interface game with anthropomorphism, at least playing it more conservatively, if not playing it more successfully.
And certainly it works because of that.
And these are examples of implementations where we're using visuals to say, hey, it's like a person. That's not always necessary. We certainly see this with some robots. Asimo had 2 sort of sensory eyes and 2 arms and 2 legs, but he's looking less and less realistic than Ms. Dewey or even Phil. We've found examples where you don't even need visuals to support this effect. You can do it with sound alone. Next generation again.
Bridge to Commander Riker. Picard to Commander Riker. Answer, please. Computer, locate Commander Riker.
Commander Riker is in his quarters.
So the computer on the Enterprise, and this has been true for all of the Star Trek series, and I imagine all the films as well, has a voice. And there's a voice interface that is both voice recognition and voice synthesis and natural language processing. Why does the computer have a voice? Well, for a film, that makes there's a real good reason, which is the computer can become a character. It's also easier to sort of portray. You don't have to keep cutting away to an image like a screen with a response on screen like we had to do with the little girl's hand in Jurassic Park. Here, the voice is a lot easier in production, but the voice does something else as well, especially since the voice is rendered so human-like as opposed to really mechanically. The more human the representation of the voice, the higher our expectations of the computer's capabilities. We think of the computer as having more capabilities and being more sophisticated because it has a more human-like voice, pretty much matching the characters, the human characters in the film. But voice alone isn't necessary to make this anthropomorphism work. Sometimes you can do it without voice with just beeps and buzzes. So poor R2-D2 is afraid, right? How do we know? Because his beeps and buzzes tell us so. It sounds kind of human-like. Now this is really interesting because there's nothing human-like about R2-D2. Doesn't look particularly human. Doesn't even talk, which is also kind of weird because C-3PO can talk, so why couldn't R2-D2, right? He only has beeps and buzzes with which to carry on any kind of display of emotion or character or personality, and he's probably one of the most beloved characters in all of Star Wars-dom. Arguably one of the best acted characters in Star Wars-dom, and he carries it off only with beeps and buzzes. That's how powerful this effect can be. We also see the same thing in Kit. I won't go through this with you. You get it, I get that. So we've gone from representation, physical representation or visual representation, to sound, like voice, and then just sounds. You don't even need any of that. Sometimes the behavior of the system essentially is creating an anthropomorphic effect. Your car, when you sort of pet it and say, like, just a couple miles more, I know there's a gas station open, that's because you're sort of anthropomorphizing your car. There's not a lot of beeps and buzzes or visuals there that are telling you your car is a person worth talking to or sympathizing with. The behavior of the system often is enough to sort of trigger this in us. It also says something about us as humans. We want to have these social interactions, even with technology, even with systems. So in this case, if you've ever been to Amazon and used one-click, essentially this is a whole behavior interaction zipped up into one button. And it's not unlike walking into, you know, your favorite bar if you have one, and there's your favorite bartender. And the moment you walk in, he sees you and he starts making your favorite drink, and it's already on your tab and ready for you by the time you get to the bar. Didn't have to order it, didn't have to pull out your credit card number. It knows you. It knows what you want, and it trusts you. And this is essentially a systemized version of a natural social interaction that we're sort of used to in our lives, which is why it's so convenient and so easy to adopt, all zipped up into one little button. That said, the likeness, the reality of the depiction is really powerful. You can do it with behavior, you can do it with beeps and buzzes, but when you start using visuals, man, it can have a powerful effect. We see this here, not with a human, but with an animal. Science fiction, we can do all sorts of weird things. This is from Until the End of the World. This is Bounty Bear.
Getting on the train.
So this is 1991. This is quite a few years ago. And this was a very interesting original depiction of a front end to a search interface. Bounty Bear is just an anthropomorphized interface for a search engine, in this case kind of a geographic GPS plus financial transaction system search code, search program. But it's not really any different than Ms. Dewey, except Ms. Dewey's not terribly nice to use, and the Bounty Bear is kind of cool and fun because of how he's represented, not too bear-like, kind of fun like a toy, but not something you would be afraid of if it was a real bear. And its interactions and its behavior are kind of limited, and that constraint actually sets realistic expectations for us. Other examples of this will go all the way to full-on indistinguishable human likeness.
Most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? I was. Look again.
Right, so they're in a virtual world. They are humans, but they're human consciousness, but they're in a virtual world. And yet Agent Smith is a program. It's a set of code, lines of code, that's all it is. But because it's represented as realistically as they are, it seems more dangerous, more capable, more sophisticated, more sinister. He's a much bigger foe as this representation that is an equal, in some cases even more than an equal because of his strength and agility, than if he was a bot or a line of code running up an iPad screen or something like that. We wouldn't have the same expectations of the capabilities of that system if it were rendered in a different likeness. You see one last example from the Matrix.
I know you're Neo.
This is the Oracle.
Am I with you?
You're the Oracle?
Bingo. Not quite what you were expecting, right? Almost done. Smell good, don't they?
Yeah.
I'd ask you to sit down, but you're not going to anyway. And don't worry about the vase.
What vase?
That vase.
So the Oracle is a prediction program. It's said, or it's rumored to be able to predict the future, and that's why he's gone to see the Oracle, because Neo has been told that he's the one, and the Oracle can validate it or not. Now this is just a set of code. These are just more lines of programming. But when the Oracle's represented as a person, not exactly the person we as the audience or even Neo were expecting, we have expectations that make us question, well, maybe the program is more sophisticated and capable as this sort of prediction program than we would have thought had he gone up to a terminal or an ATM and the Oracle sort of displayed itself as a command line interface. This is, in effect, what's happening with anthropomorphism and what's happening with this sort of realistic rendering of humanness, or in the case of the Bounty Bear, animalness. Now, this is a little bit hard to see, I know. This is a very famous diagram from some research by a researcher named Masahiro Mori. And this is, I think, 1970. And it's describing something called the uncanny valley. And what this says is that if you start on the left, the more realistic something is depicted, the more real it looks, the more comfortable we are as users or audiences with it. It says familiarity up the x-axis. I don't think familiarity is quite the right term for us. It's actually sort of comfort with devices, with systems. But a weird thing happens as you get about 3/4 of the way. You get up this slope and things are looking really good and people are really comfortable with whatever this crazy robot or anthropomorphized thing is. And then it drops off. When you get too close, what happens is things get creepy. And you see this with like social robots that in laboratories that depict facial representations. And they look sort of like animated corpses, right? There's something about them that's kind of real, but not quite and not enough. And that's the key to this research. If you get up this hill and you're going to play this game, you have to go all the way. You have to go to the matrix. Otherwise, you fall into the uncanny valley where things get creepy. You don't really want to deal with these things until those representations can then actually make good on the expectations that the representation is sort of setting expectations around. So some of the lessons here that we're learning in the social context are directly applicable to interface design today. If you have any kind of communication interface that has a representation of a person, for instance, iChat, Skype, maybe Twitter someday, etc., all of these things come in play. How real should the system be rendered? How person-like? Well, that depends on what the system can do and what your users expect of it. We saw, and we'll see in a little bit, in just a little bit, the scale of these things may have an impact on us as well. And then when you play this game, you have to play it really well, or either that or you have to render these things kind of roughly, or you're going to set expectations higher than you can attain.
So if that was that line of influence about the social context in which technology occurs, this last one is really about the technology itself, right? The new proposed paradigms. Now, as designers, we're interested in sort of the lessons from these things, and we've sort of clustered the lessons that we've gathered from proposed paradigms into sort of 3 subcategories. The first is those things that we all know, and we just want to see writ large on screen. One example of this is that constraints ease learning curves. That's oh, you told me not to do that. Sorry, Dylan. Sorry. We all know that, right? When you're using a new system, having handrails to guide you along makes it sort of easier to use. And we, as interface designers, sort of know that, but it's nice to see examples of it. This clip from The Fifth Element in 1997 shows 4 heroes trying to use a weapon that hasn't been fired for a millennium, and they just don't know how to do it.
You got it figured out, fella?
This one should be fine.
You know how all this works?
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically?
Know that the 4 stones should go around, the 5th element should be in the middle, and then the weapon against evil should work.
You've never seen this work before, have you?
No.
Every weapon has a manual. I'm sure this has one, too. That's it. That's it. Match up the symbols. Go. Go!
So the constraints in this case are the fact that you've got a triangular key and a triangular depression and a pedestal, and you can figure out how to use it. Almost any one of us could. Yeah? That's a positive example. A negative example of this lesson comes from Lifted, Pixar's short film before Ratatouille in 2007, where a young alien is sort of learning the ropes of human abduction. Poor guy. So we see this system, which is a great sort of interface humor, thank you Pixar for that, but that is simply without any constraints. And we feel for the guy, right? It's going to be really hard to learn this system, really terrifying. So that's sort of one sort of lesson or subcategory of lesson, which is stuff we know, but we see it writ large. The second subcategory are those things that may be known in a lab, but we need to sort of, but not a lot of people know it. So we can get those lessons and sort of propagate them outwards. One example of this is that inputs should know the affective or emotional states of their users. Yeah, and we have two examples that might make this clear. The first is a negative example. Again, we're going back to Luc Besson's film, The Fifth Element from 1997. In this scene, the secondary antagonist, Zorg, is choking on some cherry pits. And Vito Cornelius, the priest, is sort of taking advantage of that opportunity. But what you see here is sort of that the system is not responding to the emotional state of its user.
Where's the robot to pat you on the back? For the engineer. Are there children, maybe?
So, of course, what Zorg doesn't want is shirts to be flying out of his desk or cactuses to be popping up and down. What he wants is help. And if the system could recognize, this isn't normal behavior. Normally, Zorg doesn't press 7 buttons at once, and it should be able to call security. So this is a good negative example of that lesson.
Especially if you're the president of the corporation, right?
Yeah, you'd think. A positive example comes from 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece from 1968. In this case, I want to draw your attention, before we see the clip, to the little girl's hands as she's having this video conversation.
Specifically her right hand.
I think it is. And in the scene, Dr. Floyd is having this video call with her as he's in a satellite orbiting the Earth.
Are you coming to my party tomorrow?
I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I can't.
Why not?
Well, you know, Daddy's traveling. Very sorry about it, but I just can't.
Oh. All right.
Anything special that you want?
Yes.
What?
So right there, we can sort of see it. She begins to mash on the keys as part of her conversation.
Just like Zorg.
Just like, yes. Now, okay, we're going to give Kubrick the benefit of the doubt. This is probably an oversight on his part. He thought his daughter was cute. He would cast her. So fine, she starts mashing with the buttons. We'll just ignore that. But in fact, this is the way the system should work. Should recognize I'm dealing with a toddler. Toddler has no business pressing keys in the middle of the conversation. So as soon as that toddler begins mashing those keys, cool, we'll ignore it and let the conversation go on. So the third subcategory of sort of these lessons from proposed paradigms are those things that we can only learn when we actually prototype the thing in science fiction or in some industrial film sort of way. We have two examples of this. The first is this, what we learn when we begin to prototype holography in science fiction. I'm putting scare quotes up there only because we know the real term is, the nerd term is volumetric projection. But anyway, let's call it holography. In holography, when we prototype it, we learn something very interesting about the depiction of social relationships. To learn this, we go to Star Wars, and we're going to start with Star Wars 6, The Empire Strikes Back. Take a look when Darth Vader steps out of his pod to address the Emperor about the relationship of the Emperor's hologram to him.
What is thy bidding, my master?
There is a great disturbance in the Force.
Thank you, Emperor. So the Emperor is a giant floating head. Now, of course, if you've seen the movie, you know that the Emperor is not a giant. He is, in fact, Darth Vader's size and maybe a little shorter. But the depiction of him is sort of much larger. Let's contrast that with a hologram from Star Wars 3, Revenge of the Sith. And this time we're paying attention to the Jedi Council's hologram.
Palpatine thinks General Grievous is on Utapau. A partial message was intercepted in a diplomatic packet from the chairman of Utapau.
Act on this.
So right there, we can actually see that the Jedi take pains to make sure that all of their holograms are visually equal. This reinforces their egalitarian, sort of democratic ideals. So the projections of the hologram, when you get to play with them in science fiction, you can actually make them sort of narrative tools to reinforce those social hierarchies of the two distinct groups. And in fact, this is something that we could use even in our own work. If you were designing something like Skype or iChat, maybe you could make, well, maybe not the boss bigger, but maybe the speaker sort of larger in relation to the other speakers, and that could sort of shift off over time. So again, something we can pull from once we see this happening into our own work. The second example of this third subcategory is another sort of big mouthful, which is that intentional modality and gestural interfaces. What does that mean? In gestural interfaces, when you're using your body to interact with an interface, how does the system know the difference between when you are trying to do something and when you're just scratching your nose? Well, we actually saw this writ large on screen before we all had gestural interfaces in our homes. In Minority Report, a movie from 2002, in case you haven't seen it, this film, one of the core interfaces in it is a scrubber by which the protagonist, John Anderton, can sort of sift through video of upcoming crimes in order to try and see when and where they're going to happen so that his team can sort of prevent them.
I must have left him up in the bedroom.
That is some video of a crime about to happen. And here's John Anderton. So he's got these lights on his fingers. He's able to take a look at all the video, see, fast forward through it, scrub through it.
Sorting by race and age. Under license.
And this was all sort of burned into audience's mind when we saw it in the cinema. But there was sort of a moment, an interface joke that you may not recall, which is when John Anderton meets the investigator Danny Whitwer. And in the middle of sort of using his interface to do the scrubbing, he turns to shake his hand.
I got coffee. Thank you. Danny Whitwer, twink from the Fed.
Oh, and almost loses all of his work.
Sorry, Danny, I'm going to have to give you the full tour some other time. The Marxists moved a couple of weeks.
So John is sort of able to put that aside and say, okay, the system recovers it. But this is something that John Underkoffler and the other designers on this system sort of got to learn because they were playing with a prototype. Now, I work on a lot of future systems at Cooper, and I haven't done gestural interfaces yet, but I now know when I get there, because of this piece of science fiction, that I'm going to have some kind of modality to say, okay, don't pay attention to what I'm about to do, because I've got an itch.
And this is actually an example of a meta lesson that we've learned in the investigation that we've done, that in general, for a lot of what we found, if it works for an audience, it will in general work most likely for a user. And this is why we can take a lot of influence, a lot of inspiration from the things that we see in science fiction and bring it into our own design work. However, Minority Report here is an actual example of an exception that breaks this rule. It does not work for users to have these gestural interfaces. And dare I say, a prediction, you will not be using a gestural interface probably in your lifetime. Certainly not for anything, I'm sorry to break the news to you, certainly not for anything substantial in your work or your life. Now you might use Connect to play because that's a good mapping of the thing that you're doing in the system. But this kind of mapping of gestures to, in this case, a video scrubber, like, can you imagine what this would be like if you were tweeting or writing a Word document or doing a spreadsheet or even preparing a presentation in Keynote? It doesn't work very well. And so it's an exception to this meta rule. And the way we know this is that what we don't see as an audience is the production of the film. And until you know about the production of the film, where you learn that they had to keep cutting the filming, they had to keep taking more and more takes. Why? Because Tom Cruise's arms would get really tired. It's a very specific language he's had to learn. He has to do it right for the, the accuracy of the film. and it's so tiring that they have to take breaks.
And he's a muscly guy.
And he's a muscly guy, right? So if Tom Cruise can't use this for very long before it gets tiring, you and I are not going to be using these interfaces. That's unfortunate, but it's sort of a fact of life. Now, the gesture part in terms of touch are definitely happening. We use these all every day now with our iPads and our iPhones. So that piece of it, when it's called a touch interface, has been a really appropriate mapping of gestures to device. But these sort of arm waving things, they're going to go the way of voice recognition and voice interfaces, which I'm also sorry to tell you, you're not going to use very many in your lives, certainly not in your work world. They work in very specific places, like in your car, call mom, right? And the system is sophisticated enough, or just sophisticated enough, that it can figure out who mom is, where the number is, and can call her. And there's a good reason why you don't want to take your hands off the wheel and start using an interface. But can you imagine being in a sea of cubicles where many of us work in open plan offices, speaking to your computer everything that you're doing? A, it would be really annoying and distracting for everyone around. B, it's just calling out for pranks where someone runs down the aisle between cubicles saying something like, file, shut down, no.
Shut down,
right?
shut down, yeah.
But for other reasons, it's also not very useful in a social metaphor, because you don't necessarily want your coworkers to know what you're tweeting or what you're putting on your Facebook page, or that you're using your Facebook page while you're at work. So some of these
presentation.
Right, so some of these technologies are really cool and they're really fun. They work on screen. They won't work in real life. But in general, one of the lessons we've learned is that very often what we see in science fiction does work in real life. And this plays to a lot of meta lessons that we've learned through the bulk of this work. And one of the reasons why, so some of these lessons that we've covered already are things like the social hierarchy scale. If you're using any kind of depiction of people in your interface, that's something you can play with. You can conform to social hierarchy. You can transgress social hierarchy. Everything about anthropomorphism and representing systems as characters or humans, human-like characteristics, emotions and personality, for instance, are all things that you can bring into your systems. We've seen examples of work and solutions that have already been playing with this. Everything that we've shown you about expectations and setting expectations or playing to expectations that have already been established are ideas that you can bring into your work. Now, why is this so? Well, it's so for a couple reasons. One is that design has always been fiction. The process of making something is a fictional process. We in the UX community call it personas and user research and scenarios, but it's all fiction. In fact, it continues to be fiction until it actually happens, until it gets produced, until it goes live on the web, or until someone can purchase it in the App Store. Up until that point, it's as fictional as science fiction. This is, by the way, is the same case for anyone starting a company. All those pro forma financials in the business plan, in fact, everything in the business plan is also fiction because it hasn't happened yet. And if you've seen as many business plans as I've seen, sometimes it's really clear that it's all fiction, right? This is sort of a dirty little secret about investment, venture capital, investment and entrepreneurism. So design has been fiction all along, science fiction has been fiction all along, and that's why the relationship between the two of them can be so fruitful. If it works in science fiction, it's most likely going to work in real life. So science fiction can be used as a prototyping tool in the design process, just like every other prototyping tool. In fact, there's a gentleman in the audience from Intel, Brian David Johnson, who's written books on this and has a new one coming out, and actually uses science fiction as a design method to prototype new things in the real world of development products and services that Intel's working on or that Intel's partners are working on. So this is a valid, valuable, and influential tool that can be really powerful to help you come up with new innovations, cooler interfaces, things that work in a new way, or even things about new technology that work in a more comfortable way. The last thing about these lessons is that this is just one approach that's been applied to science fiction. You could use the same kind of investigative approach and apply it to some other method or some other domain. We've chosen science fiction because, quite frankly, it's been a lot of fun. But it doesn't have to be science fiction. You could apply this technique, and in fact, in the book that hopefully will be out this spring, we'll outline a toolkit so that you could take this method of investigation and apply it to other things to see what kind of lessons you could learn and then share with the rest of us in your work and for the good of our work as well. It also speaks to a lesson we didn't sort of intend to find out, but we've been really happy to find out, and that is that science fiction is fun and it's good for your career.
So we're near the end of our talk. Let's go ahead and cruise to the finish line and sort of put a bow on things. Like, so what? So we've gone and tried to show you about the sort of lines of influence, and eventually, when we publish the book, you'll see sort of this methodology for pulling lessons from a domain like science fiction. But what does it mean to you in the audience? So the first way is that if you are a science fiction fan like we are, then you can sort of come along for the ride, see a few of your favorite science fiction films and TV shows, and understand them through a new and sort of different lens.
Yeah, it sort of enlivens what you see, in fact. If you're a science fiction writer or producer or director or especially production designer, this gives you an avenue to finding opportunities to create more interesting, innovative science fiction than you would if you just stuck within the domain of science fiction. We've found lots of things that are out in the real world that haven't shown up in science fiction at all just because it hasn't occurred to anyone yet. So this is actually a mechanism to pull those things into science fiction and do things that nobody's ever seen before.
And sort of lastly, for the sort of small subset of the audience who are designers like we are, you can sort of use this methodology to either sort of pull the lessons that we found or go through science fiction to find some of your own and then help us make it so.
Great. Thank you very much.
That's it. We're over time.
Great.
Yep.
Right.
Bye.